It was late September 2021 when I found myself driving back roads in northern Michigan, just south of the Upper Peninsula. I'd been helping a friend move some old furniture up to his family's hunting camp near Escanaba, and after unloading everything, I figured I'd take the long way back home toward Midland. I didn't have any deadlines, and I hadn't taken time off work in a while, so I thought a slow, scenic route would do me good. It was supposed to be quiet and peaceful. The trees had already turned, deep reds and bright yellows flaring out across the two-lane roads and overgrown shoulders. It was the kind of autumn you'd see in a postcard. Still, even with all that beauty around me, I had this tightness in my chest the whole time. I didn't really understand why. The further south I got, the worse it got. My hands would clench the wheel, then relax, then clench again. I told myself it was just fatigue. Around 4 in the afternoon, I passed a gas station that looked like it had been closed for years. Beyond it, there was this narrow dirt road with a sign that had almost been swallowed up by the brush. It just said Willow Trace RD. I hadn't seen that name in years. I shouldn't have even remembered it, but I did. My ex-wife Carla used to have a cabin down that way. Well, her dad owned it, but we spent a few weeks there every summer when we were married. She kept the place after we split. I never went back. We'd been divorced 6 years by then. No kids, no real ties. We barely talked after the papers were signed. I hadn't thought of her in a long time. I don't know what made me stop and stare at that road sign for as long as I did. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. But before I knew it, I was turning the wheel and easing my truck down the gravel path. The road twisted for miles through thick woods. No cell service, no other cars, no signs of houses or life. It was quiet in a way that almost felt staged, like the silence was trying too hard. There were no birds, no wind, just the crunch of my tires on loose rock and leaves. The road hadn't been maintained in years. Big dips, water-washed patches, low branches scraping the roof of my cab. I probably should have turned back, but I kept telling myself I'd only go a little further, just to see if I could find the cabin. I didn't have any real reason to. It just felt like something I needed to do, even if I couldn't say why. After maybe 25 minutes of crawling down that road, I recognized the clearing before I saw the cabin. It opened up like a bowl in the trees, flat, quiet, untouched. There were remnants of a fire pit in the middle, ringed with moss-covered stones. The old canoe was still leaning against the same pine tree where we left it. And there it was, the cabin. It looked smaller than I remembered. The paint had faded to a dusty brownish gray. One of the window shutters was half torn off, hanging by a rusted hinge. A blue tarp covered the roof, pulled down with heavy rocks that had probably been up there for years. The place looked like it hadn't seen a soul in a long time. I parked but left the engine running. I wasn't planning to stay. I just wanted to look, just to remember for a second. I kept the truck in gear and stepped out with the door open behind me. The smell hit me first. Damp wood, dead leaves, that soft rot that creeps into everything when it's been left alone too long. It brought back this weird mix of feelings, some good, most not. Carla and I had some decent times here, sure, but toward the end, even the cabin visits were filled with tension. We stopped coming after our last fight in 2014. I walked up to the front porch. The screen door was torn, swaying a little with the breeze that had finally picked up. I stepped up onto the creaking wood slats. My boots made hollow sounds. I wasn't sure if the porch would hold me. The main door was closed, locked too. I pressed my face to the window and cupped my hands around the glass. It was dark inside, dusty. Couldn't see much. There were shapes I recognized. A table, a small couch, the old wood stove in the corner. But something felt wrong, like the place was watching me almost. I took a step back, and that's when I saw the tire tracks. They weren't mine. They were older, faded, but still clear enough in the dirt near the side of the cabin. 2 sets, One going in, one going out. Maybe from a few weeks ago, maybe more. But they weren't fresh. Still, they were recent enough to make my gut twist. Carla never let people use this place. Not even friends. It had been her dad's pride and joy, and she treated it like a shrine. After our divorce, I always figured she'd just locked it up for good. But someone had been here. I walked around the back and saw that one of the lower windows had a chunk of wood missing from the frame, like someone had pried it open. I crouched down and looked inside. There were muddy boot prints on the floor. A lot of them. Not old, not new. Weeks maybe. Months. The pattern looked wrong too. Like someone had been pacing or circling. No path from the door to the furniture, just looping steps back and forth. There was a smell coming from inside. Not just dust and rot anymore. Something sharper. Metal. Sweat. Something that made my skin feel too tight for my body. I backed away and stood there for a minute, heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had no reason to be here. But something pulled me to the treeline behind the cabin, the way we used to go to the lake path. There was a little shed there. Carla's dad kept old tools in it. It wasn't locked anymore. The door hung open, and inside was a mess of junk. Broken rakes, a shovel, torn tarps, a cooler with the lid cracked open. I walked closer and peeked inside. The cooler was empty except for what looked like matted hair stuck to the bottom. Maybe animal hair. At least I hoped so. The shed smelled worse than the cabin. I didn't stay long. That's when I heard the sound. Not loud, just a rustle. A dry, quick movement in the woods. I turned fast and scanned the trees. Nothing. But my heart was thudding now, full force. I told myself it was a deer, a squirrel, something small. But it happened again. Closer this time. A crunch in the underbrush. Deliberate. I stood completely still. Everything in me told me to get back in the truck and leave, but I couldn't move yet. My eyes scanned the trees again, and that's when I saw it. A shape, a man maybe, at least 6 feet tall, thin, wearing dark clothes that blended with the trees. He was standing perfectly still between 2 pines, not 20 yards away. I blinked and he was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. I backed up slowly, not turning my back to the woods. My legs felt stiff, heavy. I couldn't think straight. I walked faster, then broke into a jog. When I reached the truck, I slammed the door shut and locked it, even though I knew that wouldn't do much if someone really wanted in. I turned the truck around in the clearing, my tires spinning in the dirt, and gunned it back down Willow Trace. Every turn felt wrong. The road seemed longer. The trees felt closer to the truck, like they were leaning in. I was gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop driving for over 2 hours. When I finally got to a gas station with signal, I pulled over and sat in the parking lot for a long time, just breathing, just trying to process it. I told myself it was probably just some squatter, someone living off-grid, or a hunter, or maybe a drifter using the place to lay low. That happens sometimes up here, but something about it didn't sit right. A few days later, I looked up the property records online. Carla had sold the cabin in 2019 to some shell company. No contact info, no local address. I couldn't find anything about the new owners. Nothing concrete. I tried calling a county office to ask about the zoning and status of the land, but they said it had been marked private, no public access, and hung up on me when I asked too many questions. I've had trouble sleeping since. Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night, sure I've heard something outside. I'll check the locks. I've started keeping a bat by the bed. Stupid, maybe, but I can't help it. The worst part is I keep dreaming about the cabin. Not full dreams, just flashes. That window, the cooler, the man in the woods. A few weeks ago, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just a folded piece of paper inside, with 5 words written in block letters. Don't come back. Ever again. That's it. I threw it away, but I can't stop thinking about it. I still don't know who I saw that day, or why the tire tracks were there, or what happened inside that cabin after Carla sold it. I don't think I want to know anymore. I just know that something about that place changed after we left it behind. Something got in. Something real. Something dangerous. I haven't told anyone about this until now. I won't ever go back to Willow Trace Road. And I hope wherever Carla is now, she never does either. I was 38 the summer I found the dead body in that old logging cabin in northern Idaho. I'd been living in Missoula, Montana for a few years at that point, working part-time for a freight company and taking odd handyman jobs on the side. It wasn't the life I'd pictured when I was 20, but it was peaceful enough. I didn't have much tying me down. No kids, no wife, no house of my own. I had a decent truck, a German Shepherd mix named Romer, and a beat-up trailer I lived in behind a buddy's place. That was enough for me. The summer of 2016 had been a hot one. The kind of heat that makes the forests dry and brittle, where every thunderstorm is a gamble for wildfires. I was itching to get out of town for a few days, maybe go off-grid and camp somewhere deep in the woods with Romer. No phone service, just tall trees, cold creeks, and silence. I knew a spot just across the state line into Idaho, a good 2 hours drive from Missoula, and then another 45 minutes on logging roads that were barely maintained. I'd gone there a couple times the year before and never saw another soul. The place was old logging territory, had been used back in the 1960s and maybe early 70s, but most of the roads had long since overgrown. There were remnants of human activity if you looked close. Old tire ruts in the dirt, rusted metal barrels buried in moss, and, about 2 miles from the creek where I usually camped, an old logging cabin. I'd seen it before but never went inside. It was half sunken into the ground on one side, the roof sagging, boards gray with time. The thing looked like it could collapse with a strong gust of wind. I never gave it much thought. Back then I figured it was just some forgotten relic of a past nobody cared to remember. That trip, I planned to stay 4 nights. I packed up my cooler, dry food, gear, and threw everything in the truck bed. Romer jumped into the passenger seat the second I opened the door. He always knew when we were heading out. The drive out was peaceful. Asphalt turned to gravel, and then gravel turned to dirt. I passed 1 or 2 Forest Service signs, and then nothing but trees. Thick pines on both sides. We got to the spot by early afternoon. I set up camp like I always did. Tent under the trees, fire ring cleared out, and everything put up high in case of bears. Romer ran around like crazy, sniffing every rock and stump like it was his job. That first night, nothing strange happened. The wind moved through the trees, and the stars came out thick overhead. I cooked beans on the camp stove and laid back against a rock, staring up at the sky while Romer curled at my feet. The second morning, I woke up early. Maybe 5 or 6. Something felt off. Not scary or anything, just different. The forest was too quiet. Usually, birds kicked up a racket around that time. This morning, it was silent. No wind, no birds, not even squirrels. Romer sat outside the tent, ears perked, staring off into the woods like he was waiting for something. I made coffee and tried to brush it off, but the stillness crawled under my skin. After breakfast, I decided to hike out toward the old logging cabin. Not because I thought anything was wrong. I just wanted to stretch my legs, maybe poke around inside if it didn't look too unstable. Romer followed behind me, staying close instead of darting ahead like he usually did. That alone should have told me something was wrong. Took maybe 40 minutes to get there. The forest got denser the deeper I went. Deadfall across the trail in some places, big moss-covered logs that had clearly been there for decades. When I came up on the cabin, it looked worse than I remembered. Part of the roof had caved in, and the door was hanging off the hinges. The air smelled stale. Not rot exactly, something thicker, like mold and damp fabric. Romer froze about 15 feet away and didn't move. His tail was low. That was the second big red flag. I should have trusted him. Instead, I stepped up onto the soft earth in front of the cabin and pushed the door open. It didn't fall off, but it creaked so loud it echoed through the trees. The inside was mostly empty. Dusty floorboards, rusted metal tools hanging on a wall, and a pile of rotted firewood in one corner. A torn tarp covered something in the back. My eyes took a second to adjust to the light. There were holes in the roof, so shafts of sun cut through, lighting up swirls of dust in the air. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't just mold. It was that thick, sour stench of decay. Once you've smelled it, you never forget. I covered my nose and walked over to the back wall, where the tarp was. Flies buzzed in and out from underneath it. I remember thinking, don't lift it, star. Just turn around. Walk out. Pretend you never came. But I lifted it anyway. Underneath was a man, or what was left of one. He was curled on his side, knees drawn up, face turned toward the wall. His skin had that gray-green color, and parts of it looked sunken, eaten away by bugs or time. His shirt had holes in it, jeans, boots still on. One arm was stretched out like he'd tried to crawl. His mouth was open, teeth dark with rot. There was no blood, just death. I stumbled back and dropped the tarp, trying not to gag. Romer barked once outside, a short, sharp sound, then went quiet again. I stood there frozen, not afraid exactly, numb. My brain hadn't caught up yet. My first thought was maybe he'd gotten lost, some drifter who died out here. But the more I looked around the room, the more I saw little things that didn't sit right. There was a half-empty water jug in the corner, a ratty sleeping bag unrolled on the floor, a fire grate by the small stone fireplace, as if someone had been using it recently. But the body was not recent. That man had been dead for months, maybe longer. I stepped outside for air. Romer paced in a small circle, whining softly. I looked around the clearing. Nothing but trees and silence. No trail cameras.
No footprints.
No sign of anyone coming or going. Back at camp, I sat down and tried to figure out what to do. I didn't have any cell service. Not for another hour and a half back toward the main road. If I left now, I'd lose daylight. But I also didn't want to spend another night with that cabin so close by. Something about the whole thing felt wrong. Too quiet. Too convenient. The gear in the cabin wasn't scattered or broken. It looked like someone had just been there, like the body was the only thing left behind. By nightfall, I still hadn't made a decision. Couldn't sleep. Romer was restless, pacing around the tent and growling softly at the trees. Around 1 a.m., I heard movement in the woods. Not animals, not wind. Something heavy, too slow, deliberate footsteps on dry leaves. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Romer stood frozen beside me, staring out into the dark with his ears low. We sat like that for maybe 10 minutes, waiting for another sound. None came. Eventually, the forest went quiet again. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I packed up camp at first light. I hiked back past the cabin one more time. The tarp was still in place. Nothing looked disturbed, but that smell was still in the air. I didn't go inside. I drove straight back to Missoula, found the local sheriff's office, and told them everything. Gave them coordinates, described the body, the cabin, everything I'd seen. They asked if I'd touched anything, and I told them no. They said they'd send someone out, but warned me it could take a few days due to other calls and forest access. I didn't sleep much that week. Romer stayed close to me at all times, even inside. 2 days later, a detective called me back. Said they found the cabin. They found the body too. And more than that, Apparently, the man had been dead for nearly a year. But that wasn't the strange part. They also found signs of a second person, a fresher sleeping bag, footprints outside that weren't mine, more water jugs, canned food, a recently used fire grate. They never found that second person. I never went back out there. To this day, I don't know who the dead man was. The sheriff said they were working on identification, but I never got a follow-up. Maybe he was some vagrant or someone trying to disappear. Maybe the second person had nothing to do with it. Or maybe they did. All I know is someone else had been staying in that cabin after the man had already died. Living there, sleeping a few feet away from a decomposing corpse. And then they disappeared too. I think about it sometimes. When the wind is quiet and the dog stares into the trees like he sees something I don't. That stretch of forest is still out there. The cabin, too, unless the Forest Service burned it down. I wouldn't know. I don't go that way anymore. And I sure as hell don't hike near anything that used to be lived in. Not after that. I took the ranger job in the spring of 2012. I was 34 back then, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment just outside of Helena, Montana. I'd done construction for most of my 20s, and before that, a few odd warehouse jobs that didn't lead to much. I didn't grow up thinking I'd be wearing a Park Service uniform and hauling gear through the woods, but life shifts when you're not paying close attention. The job was out in the Lewis and Clark National Forest. Huge stretches of pine, spruce, and endless ridges that fold over themselves like waves. The terrain was rough, but it was quiet, and I liked being alone. My assignment was mostly patrolling a northern quadrant that didn't get a lot of visitors outside hunting season. A few hikers would pass through in the summer months, but there weren't many trailheads in that region, and people didn't go there without a reason. I was stationed at a backcountry cabin built in the late 70s. Pinefield Lookout, they called it. Just a single-room place with a tin roof and a stone chimney. The wood was old but solid. No insulation, no running water, no cell service. I had a shortwave radio for check-ins, a propane stove, and a logbook on the shelf that had been there longer than I'd been alive. Every ranger who stayed there wrote in that book. Weather conditions, sightings, incidents. It felt like the cabin had its own memory. I settled into the routine quickly. I'd hike out from the forest office every 10 days, stay for a week, then rotate back to town. I kept the trails clear, documented wildlife movements, looked for signs of illegal trapping or logging. It was basic work, but there was a calmness to it I hadn't felt in a long time. I'd spend the mornings walking old game trails and checking camera traps. In the evenings, I'd cook a can of beans or fry up a bit of meat over the fire and read whatever I brought with me. But things started to shift in mid-September of that first year. The days were still warm enough, but at night the cold came in fast, dropping hard before sunset. That week, I was due for a long stay, 9 days, due to another ranger calling in sick. I wasn't too bothered by the extension. I packed extra supplies and got dropped off near the timberline, hiking in with a heavier pack than usual. The first few nights were uneventful. I saw a big bull elk the morning after I arrived, maybe 700 pounds, moving alone along the ridge. I noted its direction and wrote it down in the log. That was typical protocol. But by the third night, I noticed something strange. There were drag marks behind the cabin. Not the kind an animal makes when it hauls a kill. These were long, smooth grooves in the dirt and pine needles. Parallel lines, maybe 3 feet apart, running from the woods toward the cabin's rear wall and stopping about 10 feet out. I figured it could be an old sled or toboggan being pulled, maybe a poacher stashing gear, but it didn't make much sense. No snow, no clear need for a sled. I walked the perimeter for half an hour, looking for prints or broken branches, but saw nothing fresh. Still, I logged the marks and moved on. The next day, I hiked out to Station Ridge to check on one of the old fire towers. It was a full day's hike there and back. I returned just before dusk, legs burning, back soaked with sweat. But what stopped me cold was the cabin door. It was slightly open. I always locked it. The latch was a heavy, rusted bolt, and it didn't open on its own. I stood there for a minute, just staring. My mind scrambled for a reason. Maybe I hadn't latched it tight. Maybe wind did it. But there wasn't a breeze strong enough that day to push open that heavy door. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and stepped inside. Everything looked untouched at first. The stove was still off, the chairs were in their place, and my sleeping bag was still rolled on the cot. But the logbook had been moved. It was open, flipped to a page I hadn't written on yet. I always left it closed after writing in it. The pencil was missing. I found it later behind the stove. I checked the windows, all shut. I walked the perimeter again with the flashlight. No tracks, no sounds, no signs of disturbance. But the drag marks were gone, like someone had come with a rake and brushed over them. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing small sounds from the trees. Snaps, faint crunches, the occasional gust of wind that didn't sound like wind at all. On the fifth night, I woke around 3 a.m. to the smell of smoke. I bolted upright, heart racing. But it wasn't fire smoke, it was cigarette smoke. Strong, stale, human. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, scanning the woods. Nothing. I circled the cabin. Still nothing. I stood there for almost 15 minutes, freezing in just my long johns, the flashlight beam shaking slightly. The smell lingered in the air for a while, then drifted away. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat at the table, waiting for the sun to rise. When it did, I made a decision. I radioed the main station and asked to be pulled out early. I told them there were signs of possible illegal activity near Pinefield Lookout. I left out the rest, didn't mention the door or the smoke, just enough to make the case for early pickup. They told me they'd send someone out in 2 days. I spent those last 2 days jumpy as hell. I didn't go far from the cabin, just short patrols within sight of the clearing. On the last night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair with the axe across my lap, listening, and I heard footsteps, not animal movement. These were slow, deliberate steps on dry leaves. They came from the west side of the cabin, one step, then a pause, another step, closer. I killed the lantern, sat perfectly still. The steps circled the cabin once, then again. I could feel every hair on my arms standing straight. Whoever it was never tried the door. They just walked the perimeter, slow and steady, and eventually the sounds stopped. I waited another full hour before I moved. Nothing else happened. At sunrise, I packed everything fast and sat on the porch with the rifle across my knees. The truck arrived around 9 a.m. The driver, a younger guy named Kyle, gave me a look. "You okay, man?" I nodded. Didn't say much on the ride back. When we got to the station, I cleaned my gear, wrote up a basic report, and clocked out. I told the supervisor that I didn't want to be assigned to Pinefield anymore. He didn't ask why. I think he could tell I had my reasons. I was moved to a southern post near the big snowy mountains.
Easier terrain, shorter patrol.
Things went back to normal. But 2 months later, I got a call from a ranger named Everett. He was new, covering the Pinefield section that fall. He asked if I ever noticed anything strange there. I asked what he meant. He said he'd found a bunch of small animal bones stacked neatly behind the cabin. Not chewed, not scattered, stacked, like someone arranged them. He thought maybe it was kids messing around. But there were no campsites in that area. No signs of hikers, just the bones and the logbook missing from the shelf. I didn't know what to tell him. I hadn't taken the book, and I didn't know who would. He said the hinges on the rear window were bent, like someone had forced it open. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept circling back to those footsteps, The cigarette smoke, the open door. Someone had been watching the cabin. Maybe for years. Maybe longer than I'd been there. I never went back to Pinefield. 3 years later, I heard the cabin had burned down in a wildfire. A freak lightning strike took out 100 acres in that section. No one was hurt. The area was too remote. They never rebuilt it. Sometimes I think about that logbook, about whoever was walking outside that night. I tell myself it was just a drifter, maybe a hunter camping off-grid. But I don't believe it. I've stayed in dozens of cabins since. But none of them ever felt like Pinefield. None of them ever felt watched. It was October 2017, and I had just turned 31. I'd been saving for a few years to buy a small patch of land far from everything. I was tired of people, tired of work, and just tired in general. I'd lived in Nottingham most of my life, working long weeks in construction and maintenance jobs. I didn't hate it, but I'd always had this idea in the back of my head. Buy some quiet land, maybe in Wales, and build something by hand. I finally pulled the trigger that summer. I bought just under 4 acres outside a small village near the Brecon Beacons. It wasn't anything fancy, hilly ground, some tree cover, no utilities, no road access. Just isolation. I planned to build a simple off-grid cabin, not for living permanently at first, but as a sort of getaway. I figured I'd build it slow, bit by bit, taking weekends and time off when I could. I had enough saved for materials and tools, and I wanted to do it myself. That was the whole point. That October, I took 10 days off and went out there to start framing the shell. I had the basic design in my head, 4x4 posts, pitched roof, sleeping loft above, big enough for a bed and a small wood stove.
No plumbing.
I'd handle the rainwater and composting stuff later. The forecast said it would be rainy most of that week, but I didn't care. I loaded my van with everything I could haul: generator, power tools, hand tools, fuel, food, tarps, timber, and drove out early on a Sunday. It took 5 hours from Nottingham, and I got there around 2 in the afternoon. The ground was soft and muddy from the earlier rains. I had to leave the van near the bottom of the slope and carry everything up by foot. I made 4 trips just getting gear and material up to the build site. The clearing I picked was up near a rise, surrounded by pines and a few old mossy oaks. Felt tucked away, safe. There was no reception, no noise, not even planes overhead. Just birds and dripping leaves. I pitched my small tent at the edge of the clearing, near where I planned to dig the post holes. The soil was damp but manageable. I set up a blue tarp over some paracord for a dry work area, set out my sawhorses, and fired up the generator to test my tools. Everything ran fine. By nightfall, it was raining again, just a light, constant drizzle tapping the tarp. I sat in the tent, reading an old paperback by torchlight and listening to the sound of rain. I fell asleep cold but excited. The next day, I started digging. The rain hadn't let up much, and the soil was heavier than I expected. I had a proper post hole digger and a trenching spade, but it was still slow going. I spent nearly the whole day just digging 6 holes for the corner posts and middle supports. My gloves were soaked. My boots were caked in black mud. I didn't see a soul, didn't hear anyone either. That night, the rain picked up. It came down steady, like a wall, pounding the tarp until water pooled in the sagging middle. I had to get out at one point, freezing and barefoot, to poke it with a stick so it wouldn't collapse. My tent leaked near the corners, and my sleeping bag was damp. I barely slept. By the 3rd day, I was sore but still in good spirits. I had the pressure-treated posts cut and braced in place with temporary supports. I'd started mixing concrete in buckets to fill the holes. It wasn't ideal in the wet, but I used plastic sheets to try and keep things as dry as possible while curing. Around the afternoon, I saw something weird. I was walking back down to the van for more supplies when I noticed tracks in the mud. Not boots, not shoes, bike tires. Someone had ridden a mountain bike up the trail that led to the logging road. I knew for a fact no one had come up when I arrived. I'd been up and down that slope a dozen times. I would have noticed. I looked around and saw nothing, heard nothing. The woods were dead quiet except for the rain and distant wind. I shrugged it off. Probably a local out riding before the weather got worse. That night, I stayed in the tent with the rain hammering down again. Harder this time. I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about those bike tracks. Who would ride out here in this weather? There were no houses nearby, no farms, nothing but old forest roads and sheep fencing. The next morning, I was back at work. I started cutting floor beams and laying them out across the posts. The mud was thicker now, clinging to everything, but the structure was starting to take shape. I kept my head down and focused. I didn't notice anything was missing until late afternoon. My second fuel can for the generator was gone. I kept it near the tarp under a bucket, and I knew it was there the night before. I searched around, thinking maybe I knocked it over or moved it and forgot, but it was just gone. No sign of spilled fuel. No track marks. Nothing. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I stood there under the tarp for a while, just staring out into the trees. They were dark, wet, swaying in the wind. I felt watched, even though I couldn't hear or see anything. It wasn't paranoia exactly, it was just a sense. Pressure, like someone had been there. I locked my tools in the van that night. I pulled the generator cables back down the hill and ran a long cord up to the build site. I didn't want anything else disappearing. I barely ate, just sat in the tent with a flashlight and knife, not reading, not sleeping, just listening. At some point in the night, maybe around 1 or 2 a.m., I heard something. A rustle close, not wind. A branch broke, deliberate, maybe 10 or 20 feet away. Then silence. Total silence. I stayed still. The flashlight was off. I held my breath. The only sound was the rain on the tarp. Nothing else happened. The next morning, the rain had slowed again. Mist hung in the trees. Everything was wet and gray. I felt like I was on another planet. I told myself I was imagining things. The missing fuel? Maybe I moved it. The sound? Probably an animal. The bike tracks? Just a rider passing through. I had to stay rational, keep working. That day, I got the floor platform finished. It felt good to walk across solid wood, to see something real taking shape. I even boiled coffee on the little camp stove and tried to enjoy it. The generator ran fine on the last bit of fuel, just enough to charge my drill batteries and run the saw for an hour. That night was quieter. I still kept the knife close, still stayed awake longer than I should have. But I felt okay. Maybe it was all in my head. Then, the next morning, I found something under the platform. A piece of cloth, green, soaked, like part of a jacket. It hadn't been there before. It was wedged up between the beams, right near the far corner. I pulled it out. It was a torn piece of sleeve with a zipper and a little square Velcro patch. Looked military or surplus. No tags, no name. Just wet, moldy fabric. I dropped it and backed away. My heart was thudding. Someone had been under the platform while I slept. That was the turning point. I knew I wasn't imagining things. I packed up everything valuable and carried it all down to the van in one go. Tools, cords, generator, everything. I didn't care how long it took. I wrapped the partially built platform in tarps and weighed them down with lumber. Then I drove to the nearest village store, 20 minutes away, and bought a padlock and chain for the van doors. I debated leaving altogether, just abandoning the site, but part of me didn't want to let it go. I had put in so much work already, and I didn't want to run just because of some weirdo in the woods. So I stayed one more night. That was a mistake. It was my last night there. I set up the tent closer to the van this time, farther down the hill, almost in the clearing where I'd parked. I didn't cook. I didn't unpack anything. I just stayed low, stayed silent. It was nearly 3 in the morning when I woke up. The rain had stopped. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. No wind. No movement. Just this stillness. Then I heard the creak. Wood. Flexing. Up the hill. The cabin floor. Then another creak. Someone walking. Very slowly. I froze. I didn't breathe. I knew those sounds. I'd walked across that floor 100 times already. I knew how the boards shifted under weight. The steps moved across the platform, then paused, then one more creak, near the edge, and then silence. I didn't move until first light. When I finally hiked back up there, I didn't find anyone, but they'd been there. I saw the prints, bare feet, large, deep in the mud, heading into the woods on the other side of the rise. Not barefoot because they lost their shoes, barefoot because they wanted to be. I packed everything into the van. I didn't finish the cabin. I didn't look back. I drove home and didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not for a long time. Later, I sold the land. Cheap. I never went back. I still build. I still work. But I don't build in the woods anymore. Not alone. Not after that. And sometimes, when it rains at night, I still hear that creak. It was mid-October 2014 when I drove up to the northern edge of Minnesota, just 20 miles shy of the Canadian border. The air was already dry and cold, and leaves had fallen early that year, covering the gravel road in rust-colored flakes. I was 33 at the time, a contractor from Sioux Falls, divorced, and in a strange chapter of my life where being alone didn't feel like loneliness anymore. I'd taken up solo hunting 2 years prior. It wasn't really about deer or elk or even being out in the wild. It was about silence. No phone.
No clients.
Just cold mornings, layered wool, and pine needles under your boots. My old man had left me a cabin up there when he passed in 2009. It wasn't much. For plywood walls, a rusted chimney, and an outhouse 30 feet into the woods. No electricity, no running water. The land was tucked between a frozen creek and an old fire road no one used anymore. I hadn't been back in nearly 3 years. After the divorce, I stopped going. Something about the place started to feel off. Not haunted or anything stupid like that, just wrong. Like the woods had shifted around it while I was gone. Still, I wanted to go back. Maybe it was the time of year, or maybe I just wanted to feel like myself again. So I packed up the truck, tossed in the .308 Winchester, some jerky, a pair of wool blankets, and 2 boxes of hand-rolled cigarettes. I told no one where I was going. That's not something I'd recommend anymore, but back then it felt like the point. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already low behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the path. The drive had taken nearly 10 hours because I'd taken the long way around. I had avoided the usual route through Warroad, instead swinging east to stay off the radar. Something about going up the old fire road always made me feel like I was sneaking into someone else's land, even though the deed was in my name. The cabin looked the same from a distance, maybe more gray than I remembered. The door hung a little crooked now, and there were scrape marks on the bottom corner like an animal had been trying to dig under. The porch was scattered with dry pine cones and broken twigs, and one of the 2 chairs had split in half. I parked about 30 feet from it, left the engine running for warmth, and stood there for a minute. Not to admire it, just to prepare myself to walk in. Inside was dust and cold and the smell of old insulation. I didn't see any obvious animal nests, though something had definitely been there. The back corner, where we used to store jerky and cans of beans, had scratch marks that didn't look like squirrel work. Bigger, clumsier. I brushed it off. Maybe a raccoon or porcupine had gotten in. Or even a black bear, though it would have had to really work to squeeze through the wall frame. I spent the next hour airing out the place. I got a fire going in the iron stove with some dry logs left behind the year before, cracked the window to let out the smoke, and rolled out the cot under the small rear window. I boiled some water over the fire, poured it into a metal bowl, and scrubbed my face, rinsing off the road dust. Felt good. The first real feeling I'd had in months. That night I didn't sleep well. There was a sound I hadn't heard before. Not the usual night noises of the woods. This was something more regular. A hollow tap, like wood knocking on wood. It wasn't loud, but it was spaced out every few minutes. I sit up, wait, and then it would come again.
Top.
Then nothing. I tried to write it off as a branch hitting the roof or some sap dripping from the pine above. But it wasn't near the roof. It sounded like it came from the treeline. I stayed up most of that night, smoking and watching the orange glow of the stove. The next morning I went out with the rifle and followed a game trail east of the cabin.
No lac.
The ground was too soft, no fresh tracks, no sign of movement. I didn't care much. I was there for the quiet more than the kill. That second night, it happened again.
Top. Top.
This time I stepped out onto the porch with a flashlight and swept the trees. Nothing. I kept the beam steady, waiting for the reflection of eyes. But there was nothing but bark and blackness. I listened hard. The forest didn't feel silent. It felt like it was holding its breath. I don't know how else to describe it. Not the kind of quiet that comforts, the kind that warns. I stayed close to the stove that night and kept the rifle loaded. I didn't sleep. By the third morning, the silence was making me feel raw. I hiked a few miles west, back toward the creek. The water had frozen in the shallows, and there were claw marks on one of the larger rocks. Not bear claws, too wide, too uneven. I stood there for a long time trying to place it. Nothing in my head matched it. It looked like someone had taken a hatchet and dragged it sideways. 3 long cuts in the ice-covered stone. Later that day, I found something worse. About 200 feet from the cabin, I came across an old trail camera strapped to a tree. One of the older models, camo casing, thick plastic body, wide lens. It wasn't mine. I hadn't put any up in years, and this one looked like it had been placed recently. The straps were tight and unworn. I climbed up to unclip it and checked the back. No brand name.
No markings.
I brought it back to the cabin and popped open the back. The SD card was still inside. My laptop was in the truck, so I plugged it in and opened the files. Hundreds of images, all night shots. The last 10 were of me, standing on the porch, sitting by the fire. One of them was from just 2 nights before, when I'd stood on the steps looking into the trees. Someone had been watching. I didn't leave right away. I should have, but something in me wanted to catch whoever it was. That was a mistake. I loaded the rifle, packed my gear, and kept the fire low that night. No light. I sat near the back window watching the clearing. The tapping started again. Louder this time. More than one.
Top. Top.
Pause. Then something new, a sound of steps on pine needles. Careful steps. No animal walked like that. It was methodical, slow. I waited with the rifle propped up, eyes fixed on the dark edge where the trees met the clearing. Then, from the corner of the porch, I heard breathing. Not loud, not ragged. Just close, calm. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I waited. Then it stopped. I counted the seconds in my head. 5, 10, 20. Nothing. When I finally got the courage to move, I crept to the door and looked out through the crack. A boot print. Not mine. Too small. Too narrow. I stayed awake until dawn, then did a full loop around the cabin. I found more prints. Same boot. Someone had circled the cabin in the night. Twice. That morning, I packed everything. I loaded the truck and planned to head out, but the road was blocked. About a mile down, a tree had been felled across the path. Fresh cut, clean, even. not something that had fallen naturally. There were saw marks on the stump, a short-handled saw by the look of it. I got out, stared at the thing, and looked around for signs. None. I had no chainsaw with me.
No axé.
I tried reversing, but the trail behind me was even tighter, branches scraping the sides of the truck. I stayed one more night, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. I locked the doors, barred the windows, and sat in the truck with the lights off. Around midnight, I saw a figure at the edge of the trees, not moving, just standing there.
No flashlight. No gear.
Just a shape, barely visible, silhouetted by the moonlight. I couldn't see their face. They didn't move. I waited for them to step forward, say something, do something, but they just stood there. Then another shape stepped out beside them. 2 figures. I sat there until the sun came up, engine idling. When I finally stepped out, they were gone. I spent the whole next day cutting away at the downed tree with a handsaw I found in the shed. It took nearly 6 hours to clear enough to squeeze through. My hands were blistered, arms numb. I drove without stopping. Didn't sleep until I crossed back into North Dakota. A week later, I went back with a sheriff's deputy and a wildlife officer. We found no footprints, no figures, and the trail cam was gone. They took my statement but said there wasn't much they could do. No damage, no theft, no threats. Just paranoia, maybe, but they didn't see the pictures. They didn't see the one photo I still have, of me standing on the porch with a shape behind me, blurred in motion, just stepping out of the shadows. I haven't gone back since. I sold the land the following spring. Never told the buyer about what happened. I still hunt, but only on public land now. Always with people. Always with cell service. And I never sleep near windows anymore. My name is Thomas. I'm 38 now, but this happened when I was 32. I was living in southern Colorado at the time, not far from the San Juan mountains. I'd been renting a small 1-bedroom apartment in Durango, trying to distance myself from everything and everyone after a pretty rough divorce. I'd grown up in New Mexico, in a town not too far from the state line, and I'd spent a lot of time outdoors, camping, hiking, hunting. So I leaned into that after the separation. Being alone in the woods felt better than being alone in the city. That's what led me back to my uncle's old cabin. He wasn't really my uncle. He was my dad's cousin, a rough old man named Roy who passed away when I was a teenager. He never had kids, never married. Lived by himself in a 1-room cabin way up near a place called Piedra Falls, off a winding forest road with no signposts. My dad used to bring me up there to visit once or twice a year, mostly when he needed to borrow Roy's tools or drop something off. I remember hating the place when I was a kid. No power, no running water, and it always smelled like rusted metal and old coffee. The roof leaked sometimes and mice ran in the walls. I never thought I'd go back there, but that year I was trying to get away from the world. And I figured if the cabin was still standing, it was free, and it was remote. That's all I needed. I packed up my truck with a week's worth of food, 2 jugs of water, a rifle, a tarp, my old camping gear, and some basic tools. The road was just as bad as I remembered. Long, narrow, steep in places, with patches of loose gravel that made the tires slip. There were no houses after a certain point. You stopped seeing fences, power lines, mailboxes, just trees and hills and silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. It was late October. The days were still warm in the sun, but nights dropped below freezing. The aspen leaves had turned, and the ground was covered in dry yellow. I parked just off the dirt path and hiked the last few hundred feet. The cabin sat in a small clearing with thick pines surrounding it on all sides. No cell signal.
No reception.
Just trees and rock and sky. It was still standing. A little more weathered, maybe. The left side of the roof sagged, and the front porch was half collapsed, but the door opened after a few hard pulls. Inside, everything was coated in dust. Mouse droppings in the corners, cobwebs in the rafters. I walked through it slowly, tapping the floorboards with my boot to make sure nothing was rotten. The wood stove was still intact. There was a metal bed frame in the corner with a busted mattress. On the back wall, above the table, hung a row of rusty tools. The place gave me the creeps. Not in a haunted house way, but in a dead space kind of way. Like nothing had moved in there for years. I cleaned it out with a rag, burned some of the old junk outside, and swept the floor until I could sit without feeling like I'd catch something. I laid my sleeping bag on top of the old mattress and kept my rifle nearby. That first night, I slept hard. Cold air pressed in through the gaps in the wood, but I was used to that. I woke up stiff but alive. I spent the first 2 days hiking during the daylight and gathering firewood. There was a stream not too far down the ridge, and I'd carry water up in a can I brought. I'd cook simple meals over the stove or outside if the wind wasn't too bad. For the first time in a long while, I felt a kind of peace. The quiet wasn't lonely. It was clean. But the third night is when things changed. I just settled in for the night, reading with my headlamp and trying not to think about the cold. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It was slow, not the wind, not a branch snapping. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the clearing. I sat up, turned off the light, and listened. The footsteps circled the cabin. Not fast, not panicked, just steady. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I grabbed my rifle and waited. My heart was going fast, but I didn't move. I didn't know what to expect. A bear? A hiker? Some idiot messing around? But nothing happened. After about 10 minutes, it stopped. I didn't hear it walk away. It just stopped. I sat awake until sunrise, frozen stiff with the gun across my lap. When the sun finally came through the slats in the wall, I went outside. There were tracks, human tracks, barefoot. The ground was cold, cold enough to sting skin raw. And these prints weren't boot marks or shoes, just long, pale feet, toes spread like hands. Some of them dug deep like the thing had weight. They came out of the woods on the north side, looped around the cabin once, and went back the same way. I followed them about 20 feet into the trees before they disappeared into the pine needles. I don't know how, but they just ended, like the thing jumped or climbed a tree, or vanished. I didn't sleep much the next night. Nothing came back.
No sounds. No footsteps.
But I kept the fire going all night and sat with my back to the wall. The next day, I told myself it was just a weird animal, maybe a sick one, maybe a local, someone playing a prank. I thought about driving back to town, but I was stubborn. I didn't want to look like I got spooked by a raccoon. But then the fourth night came. I'd gathered more wood than I needed, so I was inside early, ate cold food, didn't want to light anything that might draw attention. I stayed quiet. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, breathing. It was right outside the back wall. Deep, slow breathing. I froze, didn't move, didn't even reach for the rifle at first. Then it scratched the wall. A slow drag like nails or claws, not quick like an animal. It moved from one side of the back wall to the other, just scraping. Then it stopped. I held still for what felt like hours. Finally, I crept over and looked through a gap in the wall, just a thin crack between the boards. And I saw it, a shape. It stood maybe 20 feet from the cabin, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. It was tall, taller than any person I'd seen, maybe 7 feet, thin, arms too long. His head was bent to the side, like it was listening, or smelling. I could just barely make out the curve of its spine. It looked like it was crouching, but standing at the same time, like its legs didn't bend right. And then it moved, not like a person walks. It jerked forward, quick, inhuman, like something glitching in a video, and I couldn't move. I just pressed back against the wall, heart going wild. But it didn't come closer. It just stopped again and stared. I couldn't see its eyes, but I knew it was looking straight at me. I waited until dawn before stepping outside again. The ground was torn where it had stood. Not footprints this time, but scratches, like claws had dug into the frozen dirt. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a person. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't eat. I didn't even put the fire out. I stuffed what I could into the truck and took off. But the road was different. Branches had fallen, some thick enough to scrape the bottom of the truck. I pushed through them, but the whole forest felt wrong. Too still.
No birds.
No movement. Just silence and the sound of the engine. I made it out. I spent the night in a cheap motel in town and tried to convince myself it was just my mind. Maybe I hadn't slept. Maybe I imagined it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something followed me. Over the next few weeks, I had strange moments. Flickers of movement outside the window. Scratches on the side of my apartment wall. Once, I came home and the door was slightly open, even though I remembered locking it. But nothing was taken. I moved to Texas a month later, told everyone I needed a change. New job, new apartment, new everything. I never went back to that cabin. I told my dad I couldn't find it, that the road was washed out, that it had collapsed. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear scratching on the side of the building, or I'll wake up and swear I hear breathing just outside the window. I try not to look, because the thing I saw in the woods that night, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a man. It was something else, something that knew I saw it, something that followed me for a while. Maybe it still is. I don't know, but I never should have gone back to that cabin, and I never will again. It was early October in 2012 when I finally decided to take a break from everything. I was 34 back then, living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Pittsburgh, working night shifts at a warehouse distribution center. The noise, the traffic, the smell of car exhaust and reheated fast food, it all wore me down. I wasn't sleeping well, and I barely talked to anyone outside of work. That's when I remembered the cabin. It belonged to my Uncle Gary. He'd passed away 2 years earlier, and the place had been sitting mostly untouched since. No one else in the family wanted it. It was far out in rural West Virginia, just north of a place called Flatwoods, the kind of spot you couldn't find unless someone gave you exact directions. No GPS, no cell service, just gravel roads and endless trees. I remembered going there a few times as a kid and helping my uncle feed the animals, chickens, goats, even a couple cows. The place used to feel massive. As an adult, I figured it would feel smaller, but still quiet and far away from everything I hated in the city. I packed up some clothes, some food, tools, and a couple of books, then loaded up my old Tacoma and headed out on a Thursday morning. It took just over 4 hours to get there, and the last hour was nothing but back roads. When I finally pulled up to the place, it was late afternoon. The sun was already hanging low. The cabin sat back from the road about 200 feet, surrounded by thick woods. The gravel driveway was half covered in leaves and branches. Weeds were growing up through the stones. I stopped the truck just short of the front porch and killed the engine. The cabin was just like I remembered it. Plain with siding darkened from rain and time, a shallow porch with 2 steps, one of them cracked, and a sloped metal roof that still had that dull reddish-brown color. There was a shed off to the right, sagging at the corner, and an old well out back with a rotting cover. I walked up to the porch and tried the key I'd brought with me. Stuck a bit, but eventually turned. When I pushed open the door, it groaned like it hadn't moved in years. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. Mice had clearly been in and out. There were droppings in the corners and some shredded insulation on the floor near the stove. But overall, the place was solid. No leaks in the roof and the windows were still intact. I'd have to do some cleaning, but nothing major. I unpacked, got a small fire going in the wood stove, and heated up a can of chili. That night, I slept on the old cot in the bedroom with 2 blankets and a flashlight by my side. It was cold, but I slept better than I had in weeks. The next couple of days passed in a rhythm. I swept out the cabin, fixed the back door which was hanging crooked on its hinges, and cleared out the shed. I found an old axe that still had a decent edge on it, along with a few jugs of kerosene and a couple rusted tools. There were no animals left on the property. My uncle must have sold them off or let them go before he passed. The barn doors were still chained shut, and the fields beyond were completely overgrown, waist-high grass and saplings growing in patches. There was something nice about the quiet. It didn't feel lonely at first, just peaceful. I'd get up with the sun, make coffee on the stovetop, walk the edges of the property, then come back and whittle or read. No cell phone.
No TV.
Just the wind in the trees and the occasional cry of a hawk. I stayed close to the cabin at first, not wanting to get lost. But after the 4th day, I decided to explore a bit deeper into the woods behind the property. That's where things started to change. It was around noon when I hiked past the edge of the old field and into the thicker trees. I followed a trail of flattened grass that looked like deer had been through recently. The forest got darker quickly. The sunlight filtered through tight branches. After about 20 minutes of walking, I came to a small clearing with a ring of mossy stones in the middle. At first, I thought it might have been some old fire pit or the foundation of a structure long gone, but it didn't look like anything man-made. The stones were too irregular, too randomly spaced. I stood there for a few minutes, taking it in. The air felt cooler in that spot, and for the first time since arriving, I felt uncomfortable. Couldn't say why. It was just a bunch of rocks and trees, but something about the way the clearing sat, how silent it was, no birds, no bugs, nothing, gave me this tight feeling in my stomach. I turned around and went back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I drifted off, I'd jerk awake again, heart racing. I thought I heard footsteps outside at one point, not close, just out near the edge of the woods. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded heavier, more deliberate. The next morning, I walked the tree line, looking for tracks. I found nothing. No broken branches, no footprints in the dirt. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. I spent the next 2 days mostly inside. I read, chopped wood, cooked. I tried not to think about the clearing. But by the end of the week, I'd gotten restless again. I needed something to focus on, so I decided to check the barn. The chain on the doors was rusted but not locked. I slipped it off and pulled the doors open. Inside was dark, thick with cobwebs and dust. The floorboards creaked under my boots. Old hay bales were stacked against one wall, and a few wooden crates sat in the corner. There was also a ladder leading up to the loft. I climbed it slowly, not sure what I expected to find. At the top, the loft was mostly empty except for an old tarp and a couple metal cages that might have once held rabbits or chickens. But there was one thing that didn't make sense. A mattress. It wasn't old like the rest of the stuff in the barn. It looked like it had been dragged up there within the last couple years. There were stains on the fabric, dirt and what looked like dried blood. I backed away from it slowly. The barn didn't smell like anything had died recently, but the idea that someone might have been sleeping up there, maybe still was, made my skin crawl. I went back down, closed the barn doors, and chained them shut again. That night, I slept with the axe beside my cot. I didn't leave the cabin the next day. I kept all the windows shut, even though it got warm in the afternoon. I couldn't stop thinking about that mattress, about the clearing. I kept telling myself it was just animals, just coincidence. My uncle had been a weird guy. Maybe he dragged that mattress up there himself for some reason. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I started noticing more strange things around the cabin. Little things. A tin cup I'd left on the porch would be on the ground the next morning. A small pile of stones that hadn't been there before showed up at the foot of the steps. One morning, I found a dead crow just outside the front door. Its neck was twisted unnaturally. By day 11, I was fully on edge. I started keeping the axe on me even when I went outside to get firewood. I still hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard any vehicles or voices, but I didn't feel alone anymore. I gave it another night. One last night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the back wall of the cabin. It was light, almost gentle, like fingernails dragging across the wood. I sat up slowly and held my breath. Then it stopped. I got up and crept to the window. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I knew something had been there. I waited until morning, then went outside and walked around the cabin. On the back wall, near the bottom, were 5 long scratches. Not deep, but clearly deliberate.
Parallel.
Fresh. That was it. I packed my things and left that afternoon. As I drove down the gravel road, I stopped once to look back. The cabin sat there in the trees, silent as ever. But I knew someone or something had been out there, watching, waiting, maybe living in the barn, maybe deeper in the woods. When I got back to the city, I didn't tell anyone what happened. I left the cabin keys in a drawer and tried to forget about it. A few months later, I got a call from the sheriff's office in Flatwoods. A couple of hikers had gone missing near that area, and they were checking with property owners. I told them what I knew, which wasn't much. I didn't mention the mattress or the scratches. I didn't want to get involved. I haven't gone back since. The cabin is still there, far as I know. Maybe someone else will take it eventually, but I'll never step foot on that land again. Some places are better left alone, not because of ghosts or legends or fairy tales, but because people, real people, can be far worse, especially when they know no one's watching. It was October of 2009 when I decided to get away for a few days. I had been working a stressful job in an office building just outside Manchester, England. I was 36 at the time, recently divorced and barely holding my nerves together. My boss had granted me a week off after I screwed up a major client file, and I knew I couldn't spend that time just sitting around my apartment. I needed quiet, somewhere far from people, traffic, phone calls, and all that buzzing noise that never seemed to stop. I didn't want anything fancy like a hotel or a spa. I wanted isolation, nature, trees, dirt, wind, a place where no one would find me unless they were really looking. That's why I chose to go hiking up near Dumfries and Galloway in southern Scotland. A friend of mine, James, had once mentioned that the trails up there were quiet even during the autumn season, and the woods were deep, with very few people venturing too far off the main paths. That sounded like what I needed. I packed light, just a rucksack with water, canned food, a small camping stove, and a sleeping bag. I brought a folding map too, because I didn't trust my phone to keep a signal up there. I didn't even plan to use it. I parked my car in a small dirt lot by the edge of the woods, near a trail that wasn't well marked. It didn't look like many people used it, and that was perfect for me. I hiked for maybe 5 or 6 hours the first day, just letting the cold air work its way into my skin and lungs. There was something sharp and clean about the place. The trees were tall and thin, the light cutting down in thin slices between the branches, and the moss was thick over the rocks and roots. I barely saw any animals aside from a few birds and one red squirrel that darted across my path early in the afternoon. By late evening, I was looking for a place to sleep. I had planned to pitch a small tarp between some trees, maybe build a little fire and keep it simple. But just as I was crossing a narrow stream, I saw something off to the left, maybe 50 yards off the trail. It was an old cabin, barely visible between the trees. I thought at first it might be a hunter's shelter or a ranger post, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't being used anymore. The place looked completely abandoned. It sat on a small rise between 3 big pine trees, half sunk into the slope. The roof was sagging a little in the middle, and some of the windows were boarded up. The wood had gone gray and dry, and the front door hung open by one hinge. There was no sign of life around it, no path leading up, no signs of recent fire or food. I stood there for a while just staring at it. Part of me wanted to move on. There was something off about it. But it was cold, my legs were sore, and the idea of having even 4 walls around me sounded too good to pass up. I stepped inside carefully, pushing the door slowly so it wouldn't snap off completely. The interior smelled like damp wood, mold, and dust. There were cobwebs in the corners, and dead leaves scattered on the floor where the wind must have blown them in over the years. It was one big room with a smaller side room that looked like it had been a pantry or maybe a bathroom. The floor creaked under my boots. There was an old iron stove against the back wall, rusted and useless, and a broken chair near the window. But it was dry. That was enough for me. I unrolled my sleeping bag in the corner farthest from the door, away from the holes in the ceiling. I ate a cold can of beans and drank water straight from the bottle. I didn't bother lighting anything. I didn't want to attract attention from any random hikers or animals. Not that there was anyone around. I tried to sleep early, but I couldn't. The cabin felt too quiet. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come naturally. You know how in the woods you can usually hear leaves rustling or insects, or maybe the wind through the trees. But here, inside that cabin, everything was dead still. It wasn't just the lack of sound, it was the pressure of it. Like the air was heavier. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to real quiet. City noise follows you everywhere. Cars, TVs, sirens, people shouting. My brain was just adjusting to the silence. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't wear a watch when I hike, but judging by how dark it was and how cold, it had to be after midnight. The temperature had dropped fast. My breath was showing in the air. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter and stayed still, just listening. There was something moving outside. It was subtle but clear, slow, deliberate steps in the leaves and twigs just beyond the cabin walls. Not the scurrying of a squirrel or the padding of a fox. Heavier, slower, not in a rush. I felt my chest get tight. I lay there completely still, ears wide open, heart thudding. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a boar, but I didn't believe it. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then twice, then nothing. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for the steps to return. They didn't. When light finally came through the cracked window, I packed up my gear and left without eating. I didn't care how sore my legs were. I just needed to move. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something. There were tracks in the dirt. Not boots, not animal hooves. Just indentations, shallow and wide, like someone had been walking barefoot. But they were uneven. The right foot seemed to drag slightly, leaving a deeper line on the inside. Like whoever had made them had a bad leg. I stared at them for a while before I could force myself to walk. I didn't go back to the main trail. Instead, I cut cross-country, trying to make my own way through the woods. It was reckless and stupid, but I didn't want to go back the way I came. I didn't want to pass that cabin again. The day was long and slow. The trees were denser here. I kept expecting to hear more wildlife, but the woods were oddly quiet again. Too quiet. Every few hours, I stopped to rest, leaning against a tree or crouching behind a mossy rock. But I never really relaxed. By late afternoon, I realized I was turned around. The sun was in the wrong spot. The stream I passed wasn't the same one from the day before, and nothing looked familiar. I hadn't brought a compass, just the folding map, but the trees were so thick, I couldn't match the terrain to anything on the paper. Still, I kept moving. Then, around 6 p.m., I saw it. The same cabin. First, I thought it was a different one. Maybe another old structure left behind by hunters or loggers. But the broken door, the 3 pine trees, even the angle of the roof, it was the same place. I felt sick. I had spent the whole day walking, cutting through woods, climbing ridges and ducking under fallen trees, and somehow I had come full circle without meaning to. That wasn't just frustrating. It was terrifying. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. My hands were shaking. My legs felt numb. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Eventually, the sun dipped too low, and I had no choice but to go back inside. I couldn't risk getting caught in the woods at night with no shelter. Even if something was wrong with the place, even if someone had been outside the night before, I needed cover from the cold. I closed the door as best I could and pushed the broken chair against it. It wouldn't stop anyone from coming in, but it was all I had. I didn't sleep. I just lay in the dark, clutching my pocket knife, waiting for something to happen. And around midnight, it did. The footsteps came back. This time they were slower, heavier, and they didn't circle the cabin. They came straight to the door. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just sat there in the dark, heart racing so fast I felt dizzy. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then silence. Then a sound low, steady. Breathing. Slow, nasal breathing just beyond the wooden boards. No words.
No knocking.
Just someone standing there exhaling. Then more silence. I must have blacked out from exhaustion or fear, because the next thing I remember was light coming through the boards again. The cabin was empty. No tracks this time. Just cold air and frost on the windows. I left as soon as I could and walked straight in one direction without stopping. I ignored the map. I ignored everything. I just moved until I heard road noise again, maybe 5 or 6 hours later. I came out near a farm road, dirty, half frozen, and with a cut on my hand I didn't remember getting. I never reported it. What would I even say? There was no crime, no real evidence, and I wasn't hurt. But I did research later, weeks afterward, when I was home and warm again. I looked into old cabins in that region of Dumfries and Galloway. Found a blog by an old hiker who had been there in the 80s. He had mentioned a similar cabin, said it used to be owned by a man who disappeared after some kind of breakdown. Local farmers thought he went mad and wandered into the forest barefoot. They found his tracks years later, uneven, dragging on one side, but they never found his body. I moved to a new apartment a few months later. I didn't hike again for a long time. Sometimes I still think about that second night, the breathing outside the door, the way it didn't try to come in, the way it just stood there, waiting, watching. It never spoke, never made a sound, but I still think it wanted something. And I think if I had opened the door, it would have taken it, whatever it was. I was 32 when I was sent to check out an old company-owned logging cabin in the northern woods of Minnesota. I'd only been working for the timber survey firm for about 8 months, but I was already getting the sense that I was the kind of guy they sent to the places no one else wanted to go. I didn't argue. I needed the job. After getting laid off from a contracting gig the year before, I didn't have the luxury to turn things down. It was October 2014, just past peak season, but the leaves still had enough color that the forest looked alive. I was told the cabin hadn't been used in over a year. It had originally been built as a base for loggers back in the 70s, and lately it had been used off and on by timber scouts. The company wanted me to do a full inspection and mark down anything that needed repair, then log the surrounding terrain for future routes. They flew me into Duluth, gave me a company truck, and I drove 6 hours northwest to a place near the Canadian border. There were no real towns for miles, Just pines, dirt roads, and empty logging tracks half swallowed by undergrowth. The cabin was a few miles off the main gravel road, tucked away down a tight, single-lane path that looked more like an animal trail than anything made for a vehicle. When I pulled up, I almost didn't see it through the trees. It was just a slanted gray shadow between the pines. One-story, wide porch, tin roof. The wood siding was cracked and sun-bleached, but the place looked intact enough. No broken windows. Door was still standing. I parked beside a half-rotted shed that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. My boots sank into soft mud when I stepped out of the truck. The air smelled wet, like rotting leaves and old tree sap. No wind. The whole place felt pressed down, like the sky had lowered just for that patch of woods. The front door was locked, but the key had been left under a rusted tin can by the steps, just like the email said. I opened it and stepped inside. The cabin wasn't large. One main room with a table and 2 chairs, a small wood stove in the corner, a narrow bunk room, and a tiny kitchen with a busted refrigerator that wasn't even plugged in. No electricity.
No plumbing.
A hand pump out back for water. The walls were bare pine. Some old logging maps and rusted tools hung on pegs near the door. There was a faint smell of something musty, like old wool and mouse droppings. I set my gear down, opened the shutters to let in some light, and started my checklist. I didn't finish the first page. Right away, I noticed odd things. The table had a deep gouge down the center, like someone had dragged a blade or hatchet across it. The floorboards under the window had scuff marks, circles of worn wood that looked like someone had stood in the same place for a long time, rocking back and forth. The bunk room had a single cot against the wall, but the mattress had been slashed open. Not by animals. It looked like someone had taken a knife to it. There were still feathers on the floor, like no one had cleaned up. I stepped back outside and walked around the cabin. Behind it, there was a pile of chopped wood, half covered by a tarp. A set of tracks, boot prints, led from the back of the cabin toward the treeline. I crouched down. The mud was fresh. They weren't mine. They were already there when I arrived. I stood up and stared into the trees. Nothing. Just silent woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself maybe another employee had come by without logging the visit. Maybe a local hunter had passed through. But something about the direction of the tracks, it was like they didn't come from anywhere. They started at the cabin and vanished into the trees. I followed them a few steps, but the ground hardened quickly and the prints faded. I didn't feel like wandering deeper without a trail. I turned back. That night, I tried to sleep in the cot. I swept the feathers off and laid my sleeping bag down. The cabin was dead quiet. Too quiet. Even in thick woods, you hear things, owls, leaves, animals scuttling around. But that night, it felt like everything was holding its breath. Around 1 a.m., I heard it. A sharp, deliberate knock on the outside wall, near the bunk room window. One single knock. Not a branch. Not an animal. It was knuckles on wood. I froze, held my breath, waited. Nothing. No follow-up. Just one knock. I got up and looked out the window. Couldn't see anything.
No flashlight.
No figures. Just trees and shadow. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed sitting up, listening. No more sounds came. The next morning, I walked the perimeter again. There were more boot prints. Closer to the cabin now. Fresh. I checked the door, the windows. No sign of forced entry. But the cabin felt different, like the air inside had been stirred. I kept thinking someone had been in there while I was asleep. I checked my pack. Nothing missing, but I noticed something small and strange. One of the pencils I had left on the table was gone. Just gone. No way it rolled off. The floor was flat. I looked for it everywhere. Never found it. By mid-morning, I decided to finish my inspection and get out as fast as possible. I took photos of everything, made fast notes, and hiked a few miles out to check the old timber trails. That part of the work was fine. The woods felt normal out there, alive, not like the dead stillness around the cabin. But when I came back, the cabin door was wide open. I stood still for a long time before approaching. The truck was untouched. My gear was still where I left it. I stepped inside slowly. Nothing looked disturbed, but I noticed the bunk room smelled different, not stronger, just wrong, like old sweat soaked into wool or something sour left in a cooler too long. I left the door open, packed my gear, and decided to sleep in the truck that night. I didn't care about the cold. I locked the doors, curled up in my bag, and kept a tire iron within arm's reach. I must have drifted off sometime around midnight. When I woke up, the cabin lights were on, except there was no electricity. I know what I saw. The windows glowed with soft yellow light, not flickering like a lantern, not white like LED. It was a warm, consistent glow, like someone had installed power. I sat up and stared. The light stayed on for about a minute, then blinked out all at once. I waited until dawn before I moved. I opened the cabin door with the tire iron in my hand. Inside it was dark. No signs of fire, no smell of kerosene. But every pencil I had brought, all 6, were lined up perfectly on the table, each one sharpened, points aimed at the door. The one that had gone missing was there too. I packed everything. I got in the truck and drove straight out. Didn't stop, didn't look back. Back in Duluth, I filed the report, kept the photos to myself, and quit the next week. I didn't tell anyone why, just said I didn't want to travel anymore. 6 months later, I got a call from the only other guy I knew who'd worked that same region. His name was Clay. He told me the company was looking for someone to go back to the same cabin. He asked if I wanted to tag along since I'd already been. I told him no. 3 weeks later, Clay disappeared. They found the truck, empty, parked behind the shed. They never found him. The only thing left inside the cabin was a single pencil, point sharpened, lying in the center of the floor. My name is Tom. This happened in the autumn of 2014. I was 32 back then, single, and working in Manchester as a technician for an IT company. I'd been dealing with a lot at the time. Long shifts, a few panic attacks, and a relationship that ended in a quiet, sad way after 4 years. My ex moved out in early August, and by October, the flat felt too silent. I wasn't sleeping much, so I decided to take a week off and get away. I didn't want to travel abroad or go sightseeing. I just wanted space, stillness, somewhere I could walk, eat, read, and maybe clear my head. I found a small cabin on a rental site. It was a private listing, tucked in the hills just outside Keswick, a small town in Cumbria near the Lake District. The photos showed a plain wooden building surrounded by forest, with only one narrow track leading to it. It looked quiet and cold, which is what I wanted. The owner was an older man named David who said he'd be away while I was there, so I'd have the whole place to myself. I booked it for 6 nights, packed my car, and drove up early on a Saturday morning. The drive up was long and gray. Low clouds hovered above the peaks, and the roads turned narrow and damp the closer I got to the hills. The track to the cabin was steep and uneven, lined with tall pines and patches of mossy rock. My tires kicked up stones and mud, and I had to go slow to avoid slipping. It took nearly 10 minutes just to get up the last stretch. When I finally reached the cabin, it was just like the photos. Plain, wooden, quiet. The roof sloped slightly on one side, and a small porch faced the woods. Behind it, the trees ran thick and high for what looked like miles. I parked on the gravel patch, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The cabin was small but clean. A single bedroom, a little kitchen, a worn sofa, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in some time. There was no TV,
No Wi-Fi.
just a battery-powered radio on the shelf and a notebook left by the owner with simple instructions. How to light the stove, how to use the water pump, and where to find the emergency generator out back. He'd also written, "No one comes up here usually. If someone knocks, don't answer. It's probably a hiker who's lost. Just call the ranger." I read that line a few times. It felt odd, but I told myself it was just cautious advice. The kind of thing an older man might write without thinking. The first 2 days passed quietly. I cooked, read, and went on long walks along the muddy forest paths. The hills beyond the trees opened up into wide stretches of field and rock. It was cold and still. I barely saw a single person out there, just the occasional bird or a squirrel darting between branches. At night, I lit the fire and drank hot tea under a blanket. The silence was strange at first, but not bad. I slept better those first nights than I had in months. But on the third day, things started to shift. That morning, I woke up feeling off. I couldn't explain it. The fire had gone out during the night, and the room was freezing. The window near the bed was slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I got up, closed it, and checked the front door. It was still locked. Later, I went for a walk up the hill behind the cabin. The air was misty, and the ground was slick with damp leaves. I walked for about an hour, following the same loop I'd done the day before. But as I came back down the trail, something caught my eye. Near the base of a tree, just a few dozen yards from the cabin, there was something placed on the ground. I walked closer and saw a small stack of stones, flat and round, balanced carefully in a little pyramid. It wasn't big, maybe 10 inches tall. I stared at it for a while. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of that. I'd walked this same path twice already. I nudged it gently with my boot. It wobbled but stayed upright. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hiker or some kid playing around in the woods. I kicked it over and went back inside. That night, I lit the fire again and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing out the windows. I didn't see anything, just trees and mist. I stayed up late reading with the radio playing soft static in the background. Around midnight, I finally drifted off on the sofa. Sometime during the night, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was a feeling, like something had shifted in the air. I sat up and listened. There was a faint creaking sound, very light, not from inside the cabin. From outside, came again, a soft, slow wooden creak, like something brushing against the porch. I got up and stepped toward the window. I moved the curtain a little and looked out. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees and the edge of the porch. But then I saw it, movement, a shape, person. There was a woman standing at the edge of the porch, near the far corner. Her back was turned to me. She was still, completely still. Her hair looked dark and stringy, hanging past her shoulders. She was wearing something pale, maybe a long coat or dress. Couldn't tell. The porch light wasn't on. I froze. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the woods. My heart was thumping. I stayed by the window for maybe 2 full minutes, staring at her. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then, slowly, she took a step forward, off the porch, and walked into the trees. I stayed by the window until I couldn't see her anymore. The next morning, I walked around the porch. There were no footprints. The grass and mud were undisturbed, but the air felt different, like everything was watching me. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to Manchester, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I dreamed it. Maybe I'd been half asleep and imagined the shape. The mind plays tricks in the dark. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined her. That night, I kept the fire burning and stayed awake with a flashlight beside me. I kept checking the windows every hour. Nothing. The fourth day was gray and quiet. I didn't go walking. I stayed close to the cabin, reading and keeping an eye on the trees. Around midday, I saw something again. Another stack of stones. This one was on the porch, right near the front step. Taller this time, about a foot high. I didn't touch it. I didn't move it. I just stood there and stared at it. The fifth night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The creaking, this time closer, louder. I grabbed the flashlight and stood behind the curtain. I waited. When I looked out, she was there again. But this time, she wasn't at the edge of the porch. She was standing in front of the door, facing it. Her head was tilted slightly. Her hair hung down over her face. I could barely make out her features, but her mouth looked wrong. Like it was open, not wide, but slightly, enough to show the edge of her teeth. She didn't move. I backed away from the window. I didn't breathe. She stood there for what felt like forever, and then she turned slowly and walked back into the woods. The next morning, I checked the porch. The stone stack was gone, but on the door, just above the handle, there were faint scratches. Thin lines like fingernail marks. That was it. I decided to leave. I packed my bags in silence, loaded the car, and drove back down the steep track without stopping. When I got back to Manchester, I didn't tell anyone. Not for a long time. Not until the following spring when I saw the news. A short article in a local Keswick paper. They'd found a body in the woods, not far from the cabin. A woman in her 40s. No ID, no clear cause of death. But they estimated she died sometime the previous autumn. Around the time I was there, they published a rough sketch based on her remains. Her hair was long. Her coat was pale. They didn't know her name. No one ever came forward to claim her. The police believed she'd been living out there, surviving off rainwater, roots, scraps from hikers' campsites. But no one had seen her in months. They assumed she must have been mentally unwell, lost, wandering. I stared at the sketch for a long time. It was her. It had to be. I don't go into the woods anymore. I haven't rented a cabin since. Sometimes I still hear that slow, soft creak in the middle of the night, even though I'm back in the city. But I always remind myself there was no ghost, no shadow figure, just a real woman, flesh and bone, mind broken by something I'll never understand. And she saw me too. I was 34 when I took a job I probably should have said no to. It was in the fall of 2018, and I had just been laid off from a concrete plant outside Des Moines. I'd been working nights and weekends for almost 9 years. One morning in late September, they gathered us around and said the plant was shutting down permanently. They gave us a handshake and a check and sent us on our way. I packed everything I had into a truck I couldn't afford and drove east, figuring I'd see where I landed. 2 weeks later, a buddy of mine, Carl, got me in touch with his cousin, a guy named Ray, who owned a few acres in Kentucky and was trying to restore an old family property for short-term rentals. It wasn't much, he said, just a small wooden cabin, beat to hell, on a few overgrown acres surrounded by hills and thick trees. The kicker was that the place sat on land that used to be a graveyard. According to Ray, there were about 20 headstones still standing, all cracked and crooked, dating back to the early 1900s. Most of the bodies had been moved to a churchyard in 1979 when the county tried to clean up the area, but not all of them. There were still 6 or 7 graves no one could identify, left behind under the trees. Ray wanted someone to live out there for a few weeks to clear brush, haul garbage, and keep an eye on the place while some contractors came and went. The pay wasn't great, but he said he'd throw in an extra $1,000 if I stayed the whole month and got the power and water running again. Sounded simple. I'd worked harder for less. I met him the first week of October just outside a town called Perry Hollow. It wasn't even a town. Really, more like a broken gas station, a bait shop, and a few mobile homes scattered along the hills. He gave me a spare key, a folded map, and a prepaid phone to call him with. Then he pointed toward a dirt road and told me to follow it for about 3 miles until I saw a rusted gate with a no trespassing sign. The cabin was past that. The drive up was rough, narrow, rutted, barely wide enough for my truck. Trees leaned overhead so thick they blocked the sky. At one point, I had to get out and move a branch that had fallen over the road. But when I finally reached the gate, I saw the old sign and knew I was in the right place. The cabin sat back from the road on a sloping patch of ground, crooked and dark and swallowed up by weeds. The wood siding was sun-bleached and cracked, the front steps half-rotted through. There was a small porch barely big enough for one person to stand on, and a metal roof that looked like it had been patched up 20 years ago and forgotten. Behind it, the trees gave way to a clearing about half the size of a football field. That was the graveyard. Most of the headstones were broken or so worn down you couldn't read them. Some were knocked over, lying flat in the weeds. A few were little more than rocks stuck upright in the dirt. One corner of the graveyard had sunk in like the ground was collapsing slowly, leaving shallow pits and divots between the stones. It looked like no one had touched it in decades. I spent the first day walking the property with a notebook, listing everything I'd need. The cabin had no power, no water, no cell reception. The outhouse behind the trees was caved in, filled with old animal bones and what looked like rotted clothes. Inside the cabin, the floor sagged in the middle, and the walls were streaked with mildew. There was an old wood stove in the corner and a rusted twin bed frame under the window. The air smelled like damp rot and mouse droppings, but I'd lived in worse places before. It was quiet, at least. The first 2 days I worked from dawn to dark. I cleared brush with a machete, pulled old fence wire from the trees, and filled 6 garbage bags with broken glass, rusted cans, and old plastic jugs. I saw possums, raccoons, and even a fox, but nothing worse than that. Every so often I'd glance over at the graveyard and feel a little uneasy, but not for any good reason. It was just quiet, too quiet. By the 3rd night, I was exhausted and sore. I boiled some water on the propane burner I'd brought and washed the grime off with a rag. Then I sat out on the porch and listened to the wind. The trees moved in the dark like waves on the ocean. Something was different that night. The silence felt deeper. It was like the woods were holding their breath. Then I heard it, a short, sharp tapping sound. It came from the direction of the graveyard.
Top, top, pince, top, top.
I stood up and stared into the dark. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was a branch or maybe an animal, but I stayed on the porch until long after the stars came out. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I found small holes near one of the old graves. 3 of them, maybe 2 inches wide, dug straight into the dirt in a triangle. I figured some animal was sniffing around, but the spacing looked deliberate, almost like they'd been marked. I filled them in and moved on. That day, I focused on getting the generator working. It had been sitting under a tarp in the shed, and it took most of the afternoon to clean out the carburetor and replace the fuel lines. When I finally got it running, I walked back to the cabin and found something that froze me in place. The front door was open. I hadn't left it open. I knew that for a fact. I checked it twice before I walked away. I'd even set a concrete block in front of it to hold it closed. But now it stood wide open, creaking slightly in the wind. I stepped inside slowly, holding the crowbar I'd been using earlier. The inside looked the same, nothing missing, nothing moved, just the door. That night, I locked the door with a chain and nailed 2 boards across it. I moved the bed so it blocked the window. I sat up for hours listening. Around midnight, I heard that tapping again, faint but steady. Then a strange dragging sound, like something being pulled through the grass. I didn't go outside. I just sat on the bed with the crowbar across my lap, heart racing, until I passed out. The next morning, I checked the yard. The boards were still on the door. Nothing was moved, but there were tracks near the graveyard. Not footprints, more like smoothed over paths, like someone had dragged a heavy sack through the grass in a winding line. They went from one of the sunken graves toward the tree line, then disappeared. That afternoon, I walked the edge of the woods for nearly an hour. I didn't find anything, but I started to notice something else. Every day, like clockwork, I found new holes near the graves. Always small, always in sets of 3, sometimes 2 sets, always fresh. A week passed like that. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. I started carrying a knife on my belt. I kept the crowbar in my hand. The generator would shut off some nights for no reason, and I'd go outside and find the fuel line pulled loose. One morning, I found dead birds lined up on the porch. 4 of them, placed side by side, heads pointing west. Another day, I found my boots filled with water, sitting on the top step even though I'd left them inside. The day before the contractors were supposed to show up, I walked into the woods again. I followed a narrow trail I hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a downed tree. It wound uphill between rocks and brambles, past a rusted metal fence half buried in leaves. At the top of the ridge, I found something that made my skin go cold. A second graveyard, smaller than the first, hidden beneath thick branches. The stones were older, more worn. A few had crude names carved by hand. One said simply Mother. Another read Infant, 1902. I counted 14 stones in all. Some of the graves looked freshly disturbed. The dirt was loose, dark, turned over in patches. And next to one of the stones was a wooden box, open and empty, with strange marks etched into the sides. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the middle of the cabin with every lantern lit. Around 2 a.m., I heard something moving on the porch. Heavy steps, slow, then a long dragging sound. It stopped just outside the door. I held my breath. I heard the boards creak. Then something pressed against the door, just enough to make it groan. But it didn't open. I waited until morning, then packed everything I owned. I drove down the hill so fast I nearly flipped the truck on a curve. I didn't even stop at Ray's house. I called him from the highway and told him I wasn't going back. I didn't want the money. I didn't care about the bonus. I told him there was something wrong with that land. He laughed, told me it was just old woods playing tricks on me. I hung up and never answered when he called again. 2 months later, I got a letter from Carl. He said the contractors went up there and found the cabin burned to the ground. Total loss. No sign of arson. They said the fire started in the middle of the night, no one around. Just up and went. The weird part, the fire didn't touch the graveyard. Not a single stone was scorched. Ray never rebuilt. Far as I know, that land still sits empty. I don't tell people this story often. Not because I'm afraid they won't believe me, but because I don't like remembering it. I don't believe in ghosts or curses or any of that stuff. I believe in what I saw, and what I saw was real. There's something worse than ghosts, sometimes, and it's not buried as deep as you think. It was October 2018 when I decided to get out of town for a while. I was 33 then, burnt out, and tired of looking at concrete and traffic every day. I had taken a week off from my job at a construction supply company in Brighton, and I didn't tell anyone where I was going except my older brother. I wanted the quiet, the kind that's so still you can hear your heartbeat. My dog, Tucker, a 7-year-old black lab with a gray chin and eyes that always looked worried, needed the break as much as I did. I booked an old cabin deep in the Welsh countryside, way out near the edges of Brecon Beacons National Park. It was remote. No phone service, no internet, nothing but trees, hills, and wind. The owner was some older guy I found on a back-channel rental site. His photos of the place looked outdated, but the cabin was cheap and far enough from everything that it sounded perfect. He gave me GPS coordinates and a warning about weak roads. I packed up my gear, some food, clothes, a few books, and all of Tucker's stuff, and we hit the road early on a Monday. It took 6 hours of driving and then nearly another hour navigating rough back roads full of potholes and fallen branches before I saw the place. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt path that twisted through the trees like a snake. It was smaller than I expected. Old pine logs held it up, and the roof sagged a little at the middle like a tired back. One side faced a slow-sloping hill that dropped into a valley of mossy trees. The other side looked into the woods. There wasn't another house, vehicle, or person in sight. I felt a thrill, the kind that makes your skin tingle. This was exactly what I needed. I parked the car beside the steps, grabbed my bags, and let Tucker out. He sniffed the air, barked once, and sprinted off into the trees. I called him back, but I wasn't worried. He always stayed close. Inside, the cabin was primitive. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a dusty old bed with a mattress that smelled like mildew, a chipped sink hooked up to a rainwater barrel outside, and shelves filled with old tools and spiderwebs. It reminded me of the hunting cabins my uncle used to take me to as a kid, bare bones but sturdy. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent most of my time hiking short trails nearby, cutting wood for the stove, reading, or just watching the trees sway. The cold crept in fast after sunset, so I'd be inside by 6, wrapped in my coat with Tucker lying by the stove. I slept early and woke up at dawn. My phone was dead by the second day, but I didn't miss it. By the third night, something started to feel off. It wasn't dramatic. No horror movie jump scares. It was subtle, like the woods were holding their breath. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. Usually, you hear things out there. Birds, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush. But that evening, there was nothing. Just wind. Tucker seemed restless too. He kept pacing from the door to the window and back again, ears up, tail stiff. I figured maybe he heard a fox or a deer. I tried to shake it off, but around midnight I woke up sweating, heart pounding. I didn't remember any dream. I just felt wrong. The kind of feeling you get when you realize someone's standing behind you, even if they're not. I sat up in bed and listened. The cabin creaked a little with the wind, but that was it. Tucker was sitting up too, staring at the door, growling low in his throat. I grabbed the torch from beside the bed and opened the door. The cold hit me like a slap. I swept the light across the front yard. Nothing but trees and frost.
No footprints, no animals, no sounds.
Tucker didn't follow me out. He stayed just inside the door, alert but unmoving. After a few minutes, I went back in, bolted the door, and sat up for an hour before falling back asleep. The next morning, I found something strange. Down near the tree line, maybe 30 yards from the cabin, there were marks in the dirt. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but they weren't shaped like paws or hooves. They were long, uneven scrapes, as if someone had dragged something heavy through the soil. Tucker wouldn't go near them. He just stood there, hackles up, growling at the trees. I looked closer. The marks led from the woods to the base of the slope, then stopped. No sign of what made them. I felt that tightness in my chest again. I told myself it could have been a wild boar or even some fallen branches dragged by the wind. I had to stay logical. This was just the woods. Weird things happen out here. You just don't notice it when you live in the city. That night, I brought the axe inside with me, just in case. Tucker wouldn't settle. He kept staring at the windows, ears twitching. Around 2 a.m., I heard a sound outside. It was faint, like someone stepping on dry leaves and then stopping. Not an animal. Something heavy. I held my breath and listened. Nothing else came. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten and the birds came back. On the 5th day, I found something that really shook me. I was out chopping kindling when I saw it. Tied to a tree about 50 yards into the woods was a piece of fabric. It looked like an old shirt, faded and torn, knotted tight around the trunk. It was stained, maybe with old blood or rust. I walked closer and found more. Bits of clothing, cloth scraps tied to trees in a crude pattern, all heading deeper into the woods. It didn't make sense. There weren't any trails out there, and the area was supposed to be in used land.
No hunting blinds, no cabins.
I turned back and didn't follow them. Something in my gut told me not to. That night it rained hard. I could hear it hammering on the roof like stones. I stayed by the stove, reading an old paperback by flashlight while Tucker lay curled beside me. The wind howled louder than it had all week, and the rain sounded like footsteps. At one point, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. Not a branch, something solid. Tucker jumped up barking. I grabbed the axe, yanked the door open, and scanned the darkness. The rain blurred everything. Trees bent and shook in the wind. Shadows moved like figures. But nothing was there. I was soaked in seconds. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat in the corner with the axe in my lap until dawn. I wanted to leave, but the road was a mess from the storm. Mud, fallen trees, debris everywhere. I tried to drive out that morning but got stuck halfway up the path. The wheels just spun in the muck. I had to reverse slowly and park back by the cabin. I told myself I'd try again in the morning. Just one more night. That night was the worst. The sun went down early, and the clouds were so thick I couldn't see anything past the porch. The flashlight started to flicker, batteries dying. Tucker was silent all evening, sitting by the window, unmoving. Around midnight, he started growling again. I turned off the stove, listened hard, and I heard it. A sound I'll never forget. A slow, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled across wood. I froze. The sound moved along the side of the cabin. Not fast, just steady. Scrape, scrape, then a knock. A single, hard knock on the back wall. Not the door, the wall. I didn't move. My heart hammered in my chest, and I swear I could hear my pulse in my ears. Tucker barked once, loud and sharp, then lunged toward the back door. I grabbed his collar before he could slam into it. The knocking stopped. I held him back and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then an hour. Nothing else happened. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I saw it. Behind the cabin, right where I heard the knock, the wall was scraped. Deep gouges in the wood, like something had clawed or dragged metal across it. In the mud below were those same strange drag marks, deeper now, fresher. I followed them to the trees. They led into the forest, same direction as the scraps of fabric I'd seen before. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything fast, shoved it all in the car, and tried the road again. I kept the axe in the passenger seat and Tucker in the back. The path was still slick and narrow, but I gunned it, spinning mud the whole way up. This time I made it out. When I hit the gravel road, I didn't stop. I drove until I hit the nearest petrol station 2 hours later. I called my brother from the car park. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd cut the trip short. I didn't sleep right for weeks after that. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside my flat made me jump. Tucker wouldn't go near windows anymore. He just curled up under the table at night. A month later, I tried to look up the cabin listing again. The site was gone, completely offline. I tried reverse image searching the pictures I'd saved. Nothing.
No trace.
I even contacted a local council office to ask if they had a record of property ownership at those coordinates. They didn't. No record at all. No cabin officially listed. No land use records. Nothing. I don't know what I walked into out there, but I think something was using those woods. For what, I don't want to guess. Maybe an old hideout. Maybe worse. Maybe they didn't expect anyone to come that deep anymore. I haven't gone camping since. Not alone. Not even with Tucker. And I never will again. It was September of 2016 when I took some time off work and drove up to a cabin that used to belong to my uncle. I was 34 back then, working in construction in a small town called Worthing, not far from the southern coast of England. I'd gone through a rough couple of months, mainly due to a breakup and losing my dog in the same week. I didn't want to be around anyone, so when my mum mentioned that the old family cabin in Aberdeenshire, Scotland was still standing, I packed up my stuff and went. The place was built in the early 70s by my Uncle Tom, who passed away sometime around 2002. After that, no one really touched it. It wasn't fancy. A single room, some old furniture, a hand-built fireplace, and a rickety front porch that creaked when you stepped on it. It was surrounded by nothing but trees, miles of them, and a dirt road that wound around like a snake for about 2 miles before reaching a proper road. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no plumbing. Just a water pump outside and a compost toilet in a lean-to out back. But that's exactly what I wanted. I had this fantasy of chopping my own wood, cooking over a fire, and just letting my head clear. I arrived early in the evening after an 8-hour drive. The sun was low, and everything had that golden glow. The road got narrower the deeper I went. By the time I saw the cabin, it felt like I had left the rest of the world behind. I parked the car off to the side, got out, and stood there for a moment. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. The place looked smaller than I remembered, but it still stood solid. A little darker, the wood siding faded, and moss had taken over parts of the roof. I unloaded my bags and stepped inside. It smelled like old wood and dust. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the floorboards groaned with every step. A few of Uncle Tom's things were still there. A broken radio, a kettle, some hunting gear, and a couple of his notebooks. I didn't look through them much that first night. I just made a fire, set up my sleeping bag on the old bed frame, and lay there listening to the fire crackle. Felt good. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent the time chopping wood, fixing small things around the place, and taking walks. I brought a few books and a notebook of my own. I tried to write down what I was feeling, but the pages stayed mostly blank. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say. On the 3rd day, I decided to explore the area. I remembered that there was a small trail behind the cabin that led to an old stream. I followed it for a while, snapping twigs underfoot, watching squirrels dart from tree to tree. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. About a mile in, I found a clearing I didn't remember being there. It looked like someone had cut down trees in a rough circle. The ground was disturbed, muddy in some places. There were tracks, 2 boot prints, maybe a week or 2 old. They were too big for mine. I crouched down to look and felt that first little flicker of something in my gut. It wasn't fear, not yet, just that subtle sense that something didn't sit right. I told myself it was probably forestry workers or a hunter. Still, I turned back sooner than I'd planned. That night, I kept hearing noises outside. Not animal sounds, those I could handle. This was different. Thumps like someone stepping on soft ground. Twice I sat up and stared at the door, waiting for the handle to turn. It never did. I didn't sleep well. The next day, I went back to the clearing to take another look. I figured maybe I'd imagine the whole thing. But when I got there, more trees had been cut. Clean cuts, fresh wood still oozing sap. And there were more boot prints. I followed them this time just a short distance, maybe 50 feet. Then they stopped. Just stopped in the middle of the forest floor like the person who made them vanished into thin air. I looked around, heart thumping a little harder now, and listened. Nothing. Dead silence. I went back to the cabin without exploring any further. That night I locked the door, even though I wasn't sure how much good it would do. The lock was old and flimsy, barely more than a hook and eye. I stacked some firewood in front of the door just in case. I didn't light a fire, hoping the darkness would help me stay invisible. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, listening to the wind, the creaks, every pop of a branch outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, those footsteps. This time they were closer, right up to the side of the cabin. I held my breath. Then came the sound of something brushing against the wall. Not an animal. It was slow, deliberate. I waited until the sun came up before moving. When I finally stepped outside, there were more boot prints in the mud, circling the cabin. Same size, same tread, too big to be mine. They were spaced evenly, like the person was just walking slowly around and around. I should have left that day. I know that now, but I didn't want to believe someone was messing with me. I told myself it could have been an old hiker trail I hadn't noticed before, that maybe someone was hunting and thought I wasn't there. Maybe someone lived nearby and was curious. I don't know why I tried so hard to make it normal. I think part of me wanted to believe I could still be safe out there. I went into town that afternoon, about 30 minutes away, just to get signal and check messages. Nothing urgent. I got some supplies, filled up on petrol, and bought a cheap padlock from a hardware store. When I got back, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I found something I hadn't seen before. There was a pile of rocks stacked behind the cabin, neatly arranged, not huge, about knee-high, but someone had clearly taken time to put it together. I didn't remember seeing it when I arrived. It hadn't been there the day before. I stared at it for a while, unsure what it meant. I kicked it over. That night, I sat by the fire with the door locked and my uncle's old hunting knife beside me. I read one of his notebooks. It wasn't anything interesting, just notes about the land, types of trees, when to plant vegetables. But near the back, he'd written something odd. Just a line. If you see the cairn, don't go near it. I closed the notebook and stared at the door for a long time. The next morning, I woke up to find dead birds on the porch. 2 of them. No blood, just lying there like they'd been placed. I checked the lock, still in place, but the firewood I'd stacked behind the door had been moved. Not knocked over, moved. Stacked neatly by the fireplace. I hadn't done that. I packed that morning. I loaded everything into the car. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. Battery dead. I tried again. Nothing. The lights wouldn't come on, no dash, no click. Just silence. I opened the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but even I could tell that something had been tampered with. Wires were pulled out clean, like with a tool. Someone had been in there. I stood in the clearing for a minute, just looking at the road, wondering how far I'd get if I walked. I had enough food for another day or two, and I wasn't hurt. I could make it, but something in me wanted to wait until morning. I wanted daylight. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't make a fire. I sat on the floor with the knife and a flashlight pointed at the door. Around midnight I heard movement, this time not just around the cabin. I heard something or someone on the roof. Slow steps. I held my breath. I heard scraping like fingers or nails on the shingles. I waited until dawn before moving. When I stepped outside, there were scratches in the wood above the door, deep ones. I started walking. I took the axe with me and a backpack with water and food. I didn't look back. I followed the dirt road until it met the proper one. Took about an hour. From there, I flagged down a lorry and hitched a ride to town. I didn't go back. I filed a report with the local police. They took notes, asked a few questions, then told me they'd send someone up. I never heard back. A month later, I got a call saying the cabin had been broken into. The inside was wrecked. Someone had gone through all the drawers, broken the table, slashed the mattress. They found boot prints all over the place. Still, nothing came of it. I sold the land to a local developer the next year. I don't know who was up there with me. I don't know if they lived nearby or just wandered. But I think they'd been watching me from the start. Maybe they lived in the woods. Maybe they just waited for someone to be alone. Sometimes, when it's too quiet at night, I still hear the sound of footsteps on a roof that isn't there. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything and head out to the woods for a week. It was early fall of 2017, and I had just finished a long and brutal contract job as a welder at a shipyard near Charleston. It was the kind of work that left your hands shaking at night from the weight of the tools and the heat of the steel. My back hurt constantly, and my eyes had that gritty burn that never quite left, even when I was off the clock. I needed the kind of quiet that only the woods could offer. A friend of mine, Shane, had told me about this little off-grid cabin his uncle used to own, tucked away behind a place called Cutter's Ridge up in western North Carolina. Shane's uncle passed away years ago, and the cabin had supposedly just been sitting there all this time, gathering dust. Shane said nobody would care if I used it. No one went up there anymore. That was enough for me. I wanted solitude, and a cabin in the woods with no power, no neighbors, and no signal sounded perfect. I packed up my old Tacoma with enough food for 10 days, a couple gallons of water, my tools, a backup car battery, a first aid kit, 2 rifles, and a sidearm. I also brought an axe and a pair of binoculars I barely knew how to use. The cabin was only accessible by an old logging road that looked like it hadn't been driven on in years, according to Shane. That didn't bother me. I liked the idea of being unreachable. I left Charleston early on a Monday morning and got to Cutter's Ridge by late afternoon. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the gravel road. The air felt colder up there, sharper, like it came from somewhere older than anything man-made. I followed the directions Shane had written down for me by hand. Past the old mill, across the washed-out bridge with a leaning road closed sign, then up a barely there trail for 3 miles. Took me nearly 40 minutes to get those last 3 miles. Branches scraped both sides of the truck, and I had to stop 3 times to clear fallen limbs and rocks. At one point, I thought I might get stuck, but eventually, the trees opened up into a clearing maybe 60 feet across. And there it was, the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. A squat, single-story structure made of gray wood, with a tin roof that had rusted at the edges. One of the shutters was hanging crooked, and the front steps sagged like a drunk's knees. But it was still standing, and I wasn't about to complain. I parked the truck beside it, shut off the engine, and for the first time in a long time, listened to silence. That first night was uneventful. I cleaned out the inside of the cabin, which was dusty but mostly intact. There were a few old chairs, a wood stove, and a cot that I didn't trust, so I set up my sleeping bag on the floor. I unpacked just what I needed: flashlights, a small propane stove, food, and water. I made a can of chili, cracked a beer, and sat outside watching the stars through a break in the trees. There were no sounds beyond the bugs and the occasional snap of something in the woods. By the 3rd day, I'd fallen into a simple routine. Wake up at sunrise, boil water for coffee, hike the trails behind the cabin, chop wood, eat, read, sleep. There was no reception, no distractions, and no noise. The first few nights, I barely slept, listening to every crack and creak outside the cabin. But by the 4th night, I felt safe enough to sleep through most of it. The 5th day is when things started to feel off. It started with small things. I found a cigarette but near the fire pit that I knew wasn't mine. I hadn't seen it before, and it was still dry, meaning it hadn't been there long. I didn't smoke, and the cabin was too remote for someone to just wander by. I told myself maybe it had been buried under the leaves and I just missed it. That night, I noticed the door creaked open sometime around midnight. I was sure I had latched it, not locked, but latched it tight. The wind wasn't strong, and the door was heavy. I got up, flashlight in hand, and checked around the cabin. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone nearby. Just the woods, silent and dark. I told myself I was being paranoid. I made a point of double-checking the door the next night. I used a stick to wedge it shut. Still, I couldn't sleep well. On the 6th morning, I found something that changed everything. I had walked about a half-mile up the trail behind the cabin, toward a spot where the land sloped down into a small gully with a dried creek bed. I liked to go there and sit on a fallen log. But this time, something was different. There were boot prints, fresh ones. They weren't mine. I wore wider hiking boots. These were narrower, and I counted at least 2 different tread patterns. One set circled around the log where I usually sat. Another led off into the trees. I crouched down and touched one of them. Still damp, edges clean. I didn't sit at the log that day. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I kept looking into the trees, expecting to see someone standing there, but I never did. I thought about leaving, packing up, heading back to town, but I talked myself out of it. Maybe it was hunters. Maybe some local kids came out here to drink. Maybe I was overthinking it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat inside the cabin with my rifle propped up beside me and a flashlight in my lap, listening to every sound outside. At around 3 a.m., I heard movement. Not an animal, not the wind. Something walking, slow, deliberate steps, crunching dry leaves, then silence, then a louder crack, like someone stepping on a branch just behind the back of the cabin. I froze. I turned off the flashlight and waited, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. I waited another 30 minutes before I dared to move. When the sun finally rose, I went outside. There were more footprints. This time close, right up against the cabin wall under the window. I checked the area behind the cabin and found 2 deep boot prints under a pine tree, facing the cabin, like someone had stood there watching for a long time. I made the decision to leave that afternoon. I packed up everything, got it all into the truck, and was just about to get in when I noticed something else. My driver's side mirror was turned inward. I never touched it. Someone had been near the truck. That clinched it. I started the engine and backed out, heading down the overgrown trail faster than I should have. The branches tore at the sides of the truck, and the wheels slipped on the incline, but I didn't stop. I just kept going. Halfway down the trail, I saw it. A man, standing about 50 yards into the trees, half hidden behind a trunk. Just standing there, watching me. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, arms at his sides. I didn't stop driving. I didn't even slow down. My heart felt like it was gonna rip out of my chest. I kept looking in the mirror, but I never saw him again. It took me 2 hours to get back to the paved road, and another 5 to get back to Charleston. I didn't stop once. I didn't tell anyone what happened right away. I didn't want to sound crazy, but about a week later, I decided to do some digging. I looked up old property records, news articles, anything about Cutter's Ridge or that stretch of woods. That's when I found something. Back in 2003, a man went missing up there. A hunter. They never found his body. Then another case in 2009. A couple who went hiking and were later found dead in their tent, both shot once in the head. Robbery was ruled out.
No suspects.
And the kicker? In 2015, just 2 years before I went up there, someone reported being followed in those woods.
No arrest.
No resolution. I've never been back. Never spoken to Shane again either. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he didn't. Doesn't matter now. That cabin is probably still there, rotting into the earth. But if you ever find yourself behind Cutter's Ridge, and you think you're alone out there, listen closely. Look for the boot prints, check your mirrors, and leave before nightfall, because someone else is out there, and they're watching, always watching,